welcome to a very special occasion for Brown University, the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy, and the Watson Institute. My name is Wendy Schiller. I'm a professor of political science, and I am also the director of the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy. And we invited Darrell West to give the John Hazen White Senior Lecture because he continues to be an integral part of the Brown community, even though he left in 2008 to become vice president and director of government studies at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Darrell has been a prolific author, has written many, many books that are both political science books and crossover appeal to the public books, as well as public policy books. He is a role model in many ways. His first big book in political science, Air Wars, is still in how many printings? Like many. Seven printings, but who's counting? And that's just one book. Today, we're here to discuss Power Politics, Trump and the Assault on American Democracy, which is Darrell West's latest book. I highly recommend the book. If you have not already purchased it, you should purchase it. It's terrific, and that's what he's going to speak about today for about 30 minutes. And then I'll have just a few questions. Those of you who know me know I like to ask just a few questions. And then, of course, we'll open it up to the audience for questions as well. The book is also on sale outside this room, and they will be there a couple of minutes after the lecture ends if you want to buy a copy. And, of course, we invite you to partake in a reception after the talk. So without further ado, we welcome back Professor Darrell West, who was at Brown for more than 25 years.
Well, thank you, Wendy. It's a pleasure to be back at Brown University. I have very fond memories of my time here. Spent many a year here and always enjoy coming back. And it's a great pleasure to be with my former colleague, Wendy, who we hired many years ago. And it's been terrific to see how her career has blossomed. She's become a television star in addition to being an acclaimed academic as well, and now directing the Taubman Center and doing a terrific job. So, Wendy, thank you for the invitation, and thanks to all of you for coming out. So today I'm going to talk about my Brookings book, Power Politics, Trump and the Assault on American Democracy. And the title is a three-part summary of the book. And so I'm going to briefly review that and then work backwards in terms of how I arrived at these conclusions. So I argue in the book that we live in an era of power politics, where it's basically no longer just about civil rights, equal rights, the rule of law, and procedural justice, but it's about political power. And people who have power are exercising it. And it's different than the way things were previously. Second, Trump is a real risk to American democracy, but he's not the only risk. Sometimes I worry Americans spend too much time worrying about Trump and not recognizing that the problems of American democracy are structural and systemic in nature. Even if Trump retired tomorrow and never made another utterance on public policy or American society, Trumpism would continue. Trumpism will outlast Donald Trump himself. And so therefore, we need to understand the underlying forces that are propelling that. And then third, and finally, there's a serious assault on American democracy that's taking place, and there are no guarantees our democracy is going to survive beyond 2024. I finished the book in fall of last year, and at the time I worried that I was being too pessimistic about our future, but then over the course of the last 10, 11, and 12 months, there have been congressional hearings into January 6th. We've all learned a lot more. Now I worried that I was actually too optimistic in the book. But we do need to take this particular moment seriously. I think I am more worried about the state of our political system now than I have been during the course of my entire lifetime. We're kind of on a precipice where things can move in a variety of different directions. So that's the basic argument that I make in the book. But what I'd like to do is kind of go back and explain how I arrived at those types of conclusions. Because what I try and do in the book is to connect the dots across a variety of different types of problems of American politics these days. And that includes things such as voting rights, institutional performance. We can all see poor performance on the part of many of our leading institutions, the toxicity of our social media ecosystem, and just the way in which our system operates, and kind of the public opinion aspect of some of the things that are taking place right now. So starting with the voting area, when you look at American history, there has been a long-term trend towards the expansion of the franchise and voting in general. Like if you go back to the 1790s, I don't know what the exact percent of the American population voted among the adult population, but we're probably talking about 5 to 10%. Women did not have the right to vote, so that excluded half the population. African Americans did not have the right to vote because they were slaves. And there are a lot of states and localities that had a property requirement. So basically, the electorate was white male property owners in a lot of different places. So it was a very small slice of the American public that actually played a role in this process. But over the course of our history, we basically tried to make what started out as a republic more of a democracy. We expanded the franchise. Women got the right to vote. We had the Voting Rights Act of 1964, which empowered African Americans to vote. We lowered the voting age to 18. And then in the last couple of years, the last few years, we've added early voting and mail balloting as ways to make voting easier. The idea was that a big part of democracy is encouraging people to vote, making it easier for them to vote. And 2020 was actually one of our most successful elections ever from the standpoint of voter turnout. We had the highest turnout in almost 100 years. We should have been celebrating 2020 as a great example of American democracy in action, and instead, that did not become the narrative. The narrative became the election was stolen, there was massive voter fraud, et cetera, et cetera. And so the problem that we're facing today is there are elements that are now trying to push back on this historic trend and make it more difficult to vote. We're not taking away the right to vote in too many cases, but we're making it harder for people to vote. By the number of polling places that you have in various locations, you can influence whether people vote. If you take away polling places in minority communities, in urban areas, and we know African Americans about 90% of the time vote Democratic, there are partisan consequences to that. So there are voter suppression activities that are taking place that I worry about just in terms of what it's going to mean, both in terms of election results, but how it affects the integrity of our system, how our political system operates, who votes, what the impact of their vote is, and how effective that is. There also are complications in terms of vote counting and vote certification. We saw a lot of this on vivid display between the 2020 election and January 6th, the date when Congress actually certified Joe Biden's victory. Because it turns out, in part because we have the Electoral College determining our president as opposed to direct popular vote, there are many steps along the path in terms of the vote takes place in individual states. Somebody in that state then counts the votes get certified, electors get sent to Congress, Congress has to approve, the vice president has to approve. And what Trump showed everybody in 2020 is what we thought was a relatively clear process actually is not all that clear. And there are several ambiguities, such as, for example, does the vice president actually have the power to overturn an election and not certify a particular election? What role do the secretaries of state, the governors, and the legislature play in vote certification? It actually varies quite a bit from state to state. What happens if there is a contested election, there are allegations of voter fraud, certain votes get disqualified, and both parties basically claim victory and send two sets of electors to Congress? How does that get resolved? So there are a lot of problems that popped up in 2020 that are not resolved. Like, not a single one of those issues are really clarified now. I would have hoped and I would have thought that after the 2020 debacle, in terms of the certification aspects of it, that we would have seen the ambiguities, clarified them, passed legislation saying, no, the vice president cannot independently overturn the election, that we would have basically adopted basic reforms that would have clarified that, and of course, that has not happened. I hope, we still have 1 to 2 years to get that part of it right, but so far, Congress has not passed any reforms in that area. The social media ecosystem has become a big part of our current polarization and extremism that is making it very difficult for our system to operate. It makes it very difficult for people to have the same shared facts in terms of public dialogue, and has become a major risk and a major challenge in terms of the way that our democracy operates. This summer, I grew up in rural Ohio. I grew up on a dairy farm, and I had my 50th high school reunion. So I went back this summer, had a great time with my classmates, saw my family, and of course I saw my first Trump 2024 yard sign on the yards of one of my neighbors. And it was an interesting experience going back there because, of course, in DC, I am in a liberal bubble. 90% of the people in DC voted for Joe Biden in 2020. So only 1 out of every 10 people that I encounter there is a possible Trump voter. And it's always interesting for me to kind of go back home, which is a very conservative area, and just talk with people and kind of see how they're feeling and what they're thinking. And what I have found is there's been a lot of commentary on is just so many people still believe the 2020 election was stolen and that Biden is not a legitimate president. There are a heavy presence of climate deniers. There are vaccine skeptics. There's basically an overall mistrust of basic facts and basic expertise. And of course, they view me as having gone over to the other side. And so when I try and correct what I view as misperceptions, I am completely dismissed and I have zero credibility, especially with my family members. I have found that to be the case. And so the problem that social media is contributing to is the misinformation and disinformation that has become rampant. What the Russians did in 2016 was to teach everybody else how to manipulate our elections. And so I no longer worry so much about foreign intervention in our election. It's domestic actors basically trying to spread false information and influence the public dialogue through that kinds of means. The scariest chapter in my book was a chapter that I wrote on public opinion. And when I did the research on this, I was actually shocked at some of the things that I have found in terms of how the public actually is starting to embrace authoritarian sentiments and undemocratic means as a legitimate means of achieving political power. Basically, the worry that America is becoming authoritarian is not just an issue at the leadership level, it is an issue in terms of American public opinion. And let me tell you what I found, because there have been several surveys now of the public on some of these features of how they feel about democracy and what are legitimate means of obtaining political power. Several surveys have basically documented that up to about a third of Americans now openly express either authoritarian sentiments or support for undemocratic means of achieving political power. The surveys suggest that people are losing confidence in democracy. They no longer think that democracy is the best system. They don't think that democracy is functioning very effectively. And then the really scary part is when you break down those numbers by age, senior citizens, by and large, are still very supportive of democracy. And then as we go down the age ladder, that number starts to drop until we reach the point of young people, and they actually are not terribly sympathetic to democracy. They see a current status quo that is not working for them. which I completely understand because young people are being dealt a very bad card these days on a variety of different fronts. They feel that the status quo is not helping them with the many challenges that they face. It's a lot harder to be a young person today than what I think was true in the past. And so in a lot of respects, young people are starting to turn on democracy. Now, it's not necessarily college-educated young people that are turning, but those who are either high school dropouts or just have a high school degree, those are the people who actually are turning against democracy. And so this is something that we really need to watch very carefully because, you know, if this trend continues, you know, the worry about the continuing ability of democracy to stand up and to thrive could become seriously under pressure. So I was personally shocked at some of the data results there. I had not realized, I'd always knew there were authoritarian sentiments among the general public. I was thinking it might be 10% of the public or maybe 15% of the public. It is becoming much more widespread than what I realized. But then the real problem that I think pervades American politics these days is what political scientists call counter-majoritarianism. There's been a lot of writing on this. And it basically means that many of our leading political institutions are not operating on the principle of majority rule anymore. Majority rule on the part of the general public. So, for example, Exhibit A is the Electoral College. We all know we don't pick the president through the direct popular vote. It's the vote of the Electoral College. What a lot of people don't realize is if you look at every presidential election over the last 30 years, so basically 1992 through 2020, Republicans have won the presidential popular vote only once in that 30-year time period. That happened to be in 2004 when George W. Bush won the popular vote over the Democrat John Kerry. If you look at every other presidential election, Republicans lost the popular vote. Now, sometimes they lost the popular vote and the Democrat became president, or sometimes because of the Electoral College, they lost the popular vote and the Republican still became president. The result of all of this is in that 30-year time period, even though Republicans have lost almost every one of those presidential elections from a popular vote standpoint, they've actually controlled the presidency over 40% of the time, and they've, in my view, have actually dominated public discourse during this time period. In terms of tax policy, regulatory policy, like this whole 30 to 40-year time period has basically been marked by a stance on public policy that endorses tax cuts, deregulates the economy, and not coincidentally, income inequality has grown substantially during this time period. So the Electoral College is part of this counter-majoritarianism, but the same concept is developing in the U.S. Senate. The Senate, because every state has 2 votes, and I realize this is a risky argument making this in the state of Rhode Island. You benefit from the problem that I'm about to describe. Small states are basically overrepresented in the U.S. Senate. And of course, that was a conscious decision on the part of the founders. But it's just one more way in which our system is leaning away from majority rule. And in the U.S. Senate, we have the added complication of the filibuster, where basically you now need a supermajority of 60 votes out of 100 to basically pass basic legislation. And we know in a highly polarized and politicized time period, it's almost impossible to get 60 votes on hardly anything. And so effectively, the U.S. Senate overrepresents small and medium-sized states, and because of the filibuster, can basically block action on policies that are favored by 60 and sometimes 70% of the general public. There have been a number of surveys that have shown pretty substantial public support for immigration reform. And I believe an immigration bill actually went before the Senate, got 55 votes, but of course failed because it didn't reach the supermajority status. The public favors much more serious action on climate change. We haven't really done that much. In terms of improving economic opportunity and addressing income inequality, the public is generally supportive of measures in that. The U.S. Senate blocks a lot of that action. The US House has become a problem because of gerrymandering. There's some analysts that say 2 weeks from now, when we have our midterm elections, in order for Democrats to retain a majority in the US House, they have to win the national popular vote in House elections by almost a 53 to 47%, meaning that gerrymandering has reached a point where if Democrats win nationally, let's say 51 to 49, Republicans still are going to have a majority. So you can kind of see this anti-encounter majoritarianism playing out in a lot of different ways at the presidential level because of the Electoral College, the U.S. Senate because of the overrepresentation of small and medium-sized states, the House because of gerrymandering, and all of these changes in Congress and the presidency has now allowed Republicans to pack the federal judiciary. So we have a system that has become unrepresentative of the general public, and the problem that this creates for our political system is our government is not very effective at addressing major problems. That breeds public contempt, public cynicism, a sense that the system is not operating, and then it then allows strong men, and I use the word men deliberately, to come along and basically say, I can take care of the chaos, I can cure the disorder. It's a classic authoritarian leader's playbook, which we've seen many times in history, where an individual says, yeah, I understand things are chaotic, things are out of control, I can take care of that. You trust me, I will fix this problem, and I alone can fix that problem. So the lack of representativeness of most of our leading political institutions has become highly problematic. So earlier I made the argument that Trumpism is going to outlast Trump. And so even though I view Trump as a danger to our democratic political system, he is not the only threat or even the major threat. What is driving Trumpism, populism, and ultranationalism are several different factors. I think one of the primary things is the lack of economic opportunity. I have colleagues at Brookings who've done studies on this. We know that wage growth, controlling for inflation over the last 40 years, has basically stayed flat. And so the average person is not doing any better today than that individual was doing in 1980. Some of my colleagues in the Brookings Metro program have done an analysis in which they found that only 15% of American counties generate 70% of America's GDP. And what that means in practical terms is most of America's economic activity now is taking place on the East Coast, the West Coast, and then a few metropolitan areas in between, but most parts of America are being left behind. This is one thing Trump said, both in 2016 and 2020, that is true, and I agree with, and he's absolutely right in saying the system is failing many Americans, the system is rigged against many Americans. It's just, I would have liked it if he actually had done something to address that issue, which he promised to do in 2016, but ended up not doing. But when you have a loss of economic opportunity, the decline of the American dream, a rise of income inequality, the high cost of getting an education, healthcare, buying the first home, like I can see why young people look at this situation and say, wait a minute, the status quo is not very good. I am looking for alternative leaders, people who think out of the box, people who are not the typical kind of politician, and even a different kind of political system. When you have a fundamental inequality and lack of economic opportunity, this is what starts to happen. But it's not just about a question of economics. Culture and culture wars play a very important role in all this, because what politicians have discovered is the way to have loyal voters is to have angry voters. Like if you can make people angry about the opposition, about a group, about Mexico, about anyone, those voters will stay loyal to you because you are expressing the anger that they feel. Our politics now have a heavy element of grievance linked to questions of race, gender, and the whole question of what does it mean to be an American? Like, who is an American? Who counts as an American? Who do we want to be an American? Like, a lot of our politics are now fighting over these types of issues. In local school board races, it used to be that polarization was seen as a problem at the national level, but that localities were still innovating, they were passing policies and so on. The polarization and the hyperpartisanship that we have seen at the national level now is migrating to the state and local level. You know, one of the most contested spaces these days are school board elections. You know, schools are the hotbed of where many of these issues of race and gender and sexual identity are playing out, and people feel really strongly about those issues from a variety of different perspectives. And so when you combine kind of the lack of economic opportunity and the fact that most people have seen their wages and their economic well-being remain flat for several decades, with the culture wars that kind of raise the negative sentiments in American politics, raise the level of conflict, add an element of emotion and fear and sometimes loathing to the system, you can see how we've reached the point where we are today and how this then becomes very dangerous for American society. The third factor that I want to point out is kind of driving populism and ultranationalism is a notion of mega change. Several years ago, I wrote a book entitled Mega Change, and what I argued in that book is that we live in an era of mega change where there's large-scale transformation taking place in a variety of different ways. There's technology transformation, there's changes in our country's demography, there are changes in our economy. We're moving from an industrial to a digital economy. There are changes in business practices, like employers are moving away from permanent employees to part-time employees, independent contractors, where you basically pay a salary but don't pay benefits. Like and of course there are geopolitical changes where there are changes taking place around the world. All of these examples of mega change are making people angry, anxious, and in some cases aggressive, both in the United States as well as in other places around the world. This is a very toxic combination. And the argument that I'm making about threats to democracy, I mean, most of my book focuses on the case of the United States, but these threats are actually playing out globally as well. There are a number of countries that actually in the very recent past, like 5, 6, or 7 years ago, were considered functioning democracies that now have turned authoritarian. And examples that I would put in that category would include places like Hungary, Poland, Turkey, the Philippines, Brazil, and the list goes on. Like there are a number of places that have gone from mostly democratic, mostly functioning as a democracy, to having some or a lot of elements of authoritarianism. And Turkey is actually an interesting example. I mean, I've been to Turkey several times, and as recently as like 5 or 6 years ago, Turkey was a democracy. And then there were a series of events that took place. Erdogan basically moved in an authoritarian direction, and in very short order arrested a bunch of people, fired a bunch of people, basically imposed his model of a strong presidency on a country, and basically moved that country in much more of an authoritarian direction. And so in America, sometimes I feel like we have this ostrich tendency to put our head in the sand and ignore the reality that is taking place, both here in the United States, but also what is happening around the world, where democracies are actually losing. China actually is openly telling anybody who will listen that democracies are failing and that its model of a top-down command economy based on authoritarianism and mass surveillance is the winning system. And that system is going to triumph, and that system is going to use the latest technology to keep track of people and basically suppress opposition groups. And, you know, over the weekend, we saw President Xi basically give himself a third term, thereby breaking the term limits that previously had been in place for Chinese leaders, and basically getting rid of all of the so-called moderates on the standing committee and basically bringing in his own loyalists. So we're seeing two different things, like the countries that used to be democratic are becoming authoritarian, and the countries that were authoritarian are actually becoming even more authoritarian. And so we can't ignore these realities. And it's the reason why I have been paying close attention both to the 2022 and 2024 American elections, because we are at this critical junction. We should not assume that American democracy is going to continue. There's actually a lot of evidence to the contrary. I like to describe myself as a short-term pessimist, but a long-term optimist. And I want to explain what I mean by that, and then I'll be happy to take any questions first from Wendy and then from any of you as well. In the short run, I'm actually pessimistic for all the reasons that I just went over. There's just so many problems in terms of public opinion, voting rights, institution performance, just how people are feeling about our current situation. And I think it's going to be a chaotic next decade. It could be chaotic. It certainly is going to be disorderly. It could be violent. One of the things that scared me the most is, I think it was 8 or 9 months ago, Bill Gale is an economist at Brookings, and I co-authored a short piece on the possibility of civil war in America. And like a Brookings piece, might get read by 10,000 people or 20,000 people or 30,000 people. This piece has been read by over 400,000 people. And when I was talking to Bill, I said, this is not good. We do not want 400,000 people wanting to read an article about the possibility of civil war in America. Like, this is a bad indicator of what is going on today. So I think that the next decade is going to have many challenges as we work through all these issues. But beyond 10 years, I'm actually optimistic about the future of America from the following standpoint. I think too many people look at the current situation and basically project the current situation into the future and assume that however screwed up American politics is today, it's going to stay screwed up in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and 30 years. I actually don't think that is the case for the following two reasons. There are two fundamental changes that are starting to unfold that are going to transform American politics, move us in a very different direction, and actually help us resolve some of the issues that I have talked about. And those two trends are demographic change and generational change. On the demographic side, basically, if you add up the number of African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans by 2044, which is now just 2 decades away, those people will constitute a majority of Americans. This is going to fundamentally change our politics, our society. A lot of the conflict that is taking place today is people can see that long-term demographic change. They don't like it. Like, a lot of what we're fighting over now is kind of that future, whether we embrace that future or whether we fight that future. A lot of Trumpism is based on seeing that future and basically saying, these people they're not like us. They're not true Americans. We don't want immigrants coming to America. It's a fight over our future, questions of national identity, and what it means to be an American. But by 2030, that trend will start to accelerate in such a way that somebody like Trump campaigning on the kind of agenda and campaigning in the way in which he is campaigning actually will not be able to win a presidential election. An individual like that may be able to win a House seat and or a Senate race, because there are states that are more conservative and would remain sympathetic to that. But in a national presidential election, I don't think 10 years from now, somebody like Trump can win. And so Republicans actually have a great short-term strategy for winning elections, but a terrible long-term strategy. Their voters are going to disappear. The generational change aspect is, if you look at public opinion, people under the age of 30 are more liberal than people over the age of 60. There's a pretty clear divide on issues of income inequality, dealing with racial equity questions, dealing with climate change. I mean, you can kind of go down a long list of factors. Young people are different in their views. They're different on social issues, on cultural issues, on economic issues, et cetera, et cetera. So by 2030, things that seem completely impossible today are going to be possible. The kind of political system that we're going to have and the kind of political debates that we're going to have 10 years from now are going to be different than what we have now. The 1896 election was a fight over gold and silver as the basis of our currency. Do any of you actually care about that issue now? No, you don't. Like, issues come and go. Like, things that galvanize society and people fight over viciously at one point in time, like 10 years later or 20 years later or 30 years later, they don't care about that. Either it has receded in importance, or maybe we resolved the issue in some way, or something changed that, that kind of took that issue away. I think the same thing is going to happen in the United States, because the combination of our changing demography and the changing generations will put America in a very different position. So on a longer term basis, I'm actually not so worried about America. I know there's a lot of doom and gloom about our current situation, and I share a number of those concerns, but I do think if we can get through the next 10 years, we actually are very well positioned to deal with a number of these issues, to reform our political institutions, to get rid of the Electoral College, which we need to do. And I know friends of mine have told me I'm crazy, like, it's part of the Constitution, we're never going to get rid of it. And what I tell them is, as soon as Texas becomes competitive at the presidential level, we're going to get rid of the Electoral College. Because if Democrats are in a situation where they can win New York, California, and Texas, there's never going to be another Republican president at that point. And then Republicans are going to want to get rid of the Electoral College. At that point, there will be bipartisan support to get rid of the Electoral College. So I think that there's a lot going on right now. It's easy to worry about what is going on, but the key thing is we have to get through the next decade. It's not going to be easy, but if somehow we can do that, America actually is poised for a greatness in the longer run. And with that, Wendy, I will turn it back to you. Thank you.
We're going to ask Darrell if you want to come take a seat, and that way we can see the audience. And so I think I will give folks who've come a chance to ask questions first, and then I'll ask questions if there's a gap. So who wants to be the first person to ask questions? Okay, Othniel Harris, our program manager at Taubman. We're going to try to pass around a mic, so we are recording this, so we want to make sure our viewers and listeners.
Enjoyed it. The last thing in the world I want to do is argue with your long-term optimism. But everything that I've been reading talk about the expected shift of black population and the Latino population away from the Democrats, particularly in the border states, including Florida, Texas, and Arizona. I wonder if that may turn around and bite you in the, bite you.
That is a very good point, and especially on the Latino front, and you're exactly right that Democrats still are going to get a clear majority of the Latino vote, but both in 2020, and we expect the same thing to happen in 2022, the Democratic margin is starting to drop. It used to be very easy for Democratic candidates to get 2/3 or more of the Latino vote. That is now starting to drop down to 60%. So Democrats are still doing very well. They're actually very well positioned for that vote. I think Democrats have actually been very ineffective at keeping the Latino vote in the Democratic fold. In part, the Latino vote is complicated because people come from different countries, so it's actually not one vote. It's a lot of different votes with a lot of different viewpoints. And where Republicans have made inroads is basically you would think that their position on immigration policy alone would disqualify them from the Latino vote in a lot of areas, but Republicans have appealed to them on foreign policy issues, on cultural issues. Some of these education issues related to identity politics have been attractive to Latinos. So You're correct that as America moves towards becoming a majority-minority country, that bloc may not stay together, and so therefore it could be possible for Republicans to divide and conquer, but that's only if Democrats let that happen. They would be stupid to let that happen because right now they have clear advantages with each of those groups, and they need to pay attention to why they're starting to lose the votes, and they need to make some policy changes in their agenda to stop that erosion from taking place, because that is the one thing that actually could derail some of that optimism.
Okay, any other questions? Yes, sir. We're going to wait for the mic. We're going to give you the mic. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much for the discussion. My question has to do with the title, Power in Politics. With your projection of demographics being a positive in 10 years, could you explain how that intersects with the money in 10 years?
The money, like do you mean like campaign contributions?
In politics, money in general.
Yep.
That, yeah.
Okay. That is actually another powerful factor leading to our country becoming an unrepresentative and counter-majoritarian country, because, and it's a pure function of income inequality, that wealthy individuals are able to put millions of dollars into campaigns, which they are doing, and gaining disproportionate benefits. Like one of the reasons we have had the tax policies that we've had over the last 30 to 40 years, it's not public opinion. The public actually supports raising tax rates for wealthy individuals. It's the donor community that basically has funded both Republicans and Democrats, and they've turned Republicans into a pure tax-cutting party, and they've turned Democrats into a business-friendly kind of political party. And so the role of money has been completely corrosive. The funny thing is, in 1976, after the Watergate scandal, America passed bipartisan campaign finance reform, and we actually had a really good system of campaign finance. But then what has happened over the last 50 years is bit by bit, there have been loopholes created, mainly through Supreme Court decisions. In my view, the Supreme Court is the real culprit here, because they have equated the right to spend with the right to speech. I view those as different things. Like if you want to spend $10 million influencing a campaign, you have a lot more speech than I have, like if I'm going to make a $50 contribution. The court basically equated money and speech, and therefore basically eviscerated what was a very good campaign finance system. So that is a big part of our current problem, but there's an easy fix to that problem, which is fixing the Supreme Court. Like if we fix the Supreme Court, we can fix that problem. But until we fix the Supreme Court, we can't fix that problem.
What do you mean by fixing the Supreme Court?
The easy way to fix it is for Democrats to start doing better in elections and being in a position where they can nominate people. I think it's not going to get fixed likely in the next decade, but in the longer run, many of the public opinion trends are going to run in a more liberal direction, and therefore Democrats will do better and will be in a position to start to dominate the court.
Yeah, I want to just push back a little bit on that idea about fixing the Supreme Court. People focus a lot on the Electoral College, but the Supreme Court, some people have argued, maybe is the most counter-majoritarian institution that we have, starting with Thomas Jefferson, who was highly irritated with John Marshall, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in Marbury v. Madison. So he was irritated because he thought the court had overstepped in establishing, as the students from my class remember from the exam, judicial review. The idea that the court could rule things constitutional or unconstitutional, or behavior by the other branches as constitutional or unconstitutional, was an overreach, according to Jefferson. He said, we have, in those days, the number wasn't always set, but he said, we have sort of 9 people sitting up there. That's an oligarchy. That overturns everything else that we do in our democracy. And so the idea of fixing it by getting maybe more moderate judges on there, you still have an extraordinarily counter-majoritarian institution. Is it possible that, unlike the Electoral College, which we can differ on whether we think it goes away or not, that the Supreme Court itself actually gets abolished and it replaces it in its stead? Because Congress essentially created the federal judiciary, and Congress can change it.
I would not support that proposal. I actually have enough faith in our political system on a longer-term basis that I think through existing means we will get a fairer and more equitable Supreme Court. It's going to take a few years to reach that point, but we will get to that point.
So, any other questions? Yes, sir. And then Maureen, are you next? We'll get, okay.
If, God forbid, the Congress is lost to the Republican majority and a Republican takes office as president in 2024, if they follow what they're talking about doing in extremes like abandoning or changing Social Security, Medicare and stuff, do you think there would be enough counter to that among the people who really now may be supporting Republicans, realizing, hey, this isn't good at all? Could that happen?
Yes. I think the way that many leaders screw up when they start to move in that kind of direction is severe overreaching. Like, we actually just saw an example of that in the UK with the former prime minister, who put out this bold program that people hated and the market hated, and she basically lost her job over that. When political minorities gain power and overreach and do a lot of things that are not supported by public opinion, they can do that for a limited period of time, but it will catch up with them and there will be a backlash. So I do think that there are some self-correcting mechanisms still built into our system. Also, one of the virtues of a system based on federalism is power is never complete in America. Like, even if Republicans, control Congress and the presidency after 2024, we still have state and local governments. There's going to be a lot of fights between the national level and state and local government. And in the Turkish example, like, Erdogan has tried to, have rather complete control. He has now lost all the major cities. Like, the opposition controls the major cities in Turkey. So even he has not managed to impose his will on a political system that's completely rigged in his favor.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, there are two things that come to mind. One is George W. Bush, in December of 2004, right after he got reelected, put out a mild proposal to do some sort of means testing or invest some portion of your wages that were going into Social Security, into the stock market, and it lasted literally 3 to 4 weeks, before the senior Republicans in the House and Senate said, we're not doing this. We're not touching Social Security. So that was done, over. And Medicare had been expanded. The largest single expansion of Medicare was the Prescription Drug Act passed under the Bush administration. So that Republican Party is different today, although Mitch McConnell was there at that time too. And then again, Donald Trump. Paul Ryan was Speaker of the House, Republican, and working with Donald Trump. And Paul Ryan has always wanted to just get rid of Medicare. He thinks it's a terrible system, and Social Security. And he proposed those things. And Donald Trump said, I'm not touching that. These are my people. We know that, people over the age of 65, 72% of them vote, and 56% vote Republican in presidential elections.
I hate that you pointed to me when you made that
No, I
argument.
did not. I did not. I'm going everywhere. No. So I always tell my students, 48% of people between 18 and 30 vote in presidential elections. So there's a big gulf there. So in that sense, what Darrell brings up, not only in his talk, but also the book, is that we still, when we speak about politics, we have to update our assessments of what is the Republican Party, what is the Democratic Party. It is not the party of George W. Bush. It's not even the party, really, of Mitch McConnell anymore. It's a different party. So it's a majority of the Republican caucus voted to, not certify Joe Biden's election. That's a majority of the Republicans in the House in 2021. That majority, those people grow. Then the Republican Party, as we know it, is not the same party. So it may be more popular among that Republican Party. However, if they're coming from a lot of rural areas and they're winning elections in districts really with a lot of senior voting, it's a hard thing to explain. Even if they want to do it, it's hard to explain. And we know in politics, if it takes longer than 15 seconds to explain, nobody wants to do it. So I think those third rails, the combined third rails, are still pretty hot to touch in terms of those kinds of things. So I want to get to Maureen Moakley, who's also a political science professor from the University of Rhode Island and also a political commentator, I'm sure many of you know.
Hi, I just wanted to ask you, Darrell, in your data, did the younger people, the disillusioned people that you're talking about, do they make any cognitive leap or assessment about the structural problems? I mean, in other words, they don't sit around and say, I'm really angry, I don't like democracy, we should reform the Electoral College. I mean, that's a latent kind of thing, but there's no, is there any explicit recognition that the kind of function of the system is what's resulting in their disillusionment?
I mean, they clearly understand their economic situation is very difficult and very problematic. And I think the thought process they're going through is, if they're doing so poorly under the status quo, we should start to think about non-status quo solutions, which makes them open to more radical change than otherwise one might want. And by the way, we should not assume that it's only conservative young people who are feeling that way. Like, there are liberal young people who also do not like the current system, do not like the status quo, and they also are becoming more open to some other type of system. Now, what kind of system it is will vary among a lot of different people, but there's a surprising amount of support for something very different than what we have right now among a wide range of political viewpoints of young people.
Do you want to follow up, or you?
Like what? I mean, what are the other options? I mean, how did they express this?
Well, there's clear support for undemocratic means of reaching power. So, for example, there have been questions asked such as, if there's an allegation of voter fraud in an election, should the state legislature of that state have the power to basically overturn who appeared to be the winning election? A lot of people actually support that. Yes. Well, people in general, like a third, but younger people as well. If you don't like the ruling by a particular judge, should we basically ignore the courts? There actually are a growing number of people across the political spectrum that feel that way because the legitimacy of the court is dropping. So the things that we traditionally define as part of our democracy and the rule of law, support for those features are eroding because people don't have confidence in the way our system is operating.
So anybody have a question from the audience? Yes, sir.
I have a sense that a significant part of the erosion that's been taking place started with a contract with America, Newt Gingrich, because essentially he was saying, well, what that contract says, there's only one way to do it. We don't talk to the other people who don't agree with that way. Would you comment on that?
I would say the '94 election was a turning point, but it was not the only turning point. I mean, I would say the 1980 election that gave us Reagan kind of ushered in tax policies that had the effect of increasing income inequality. Gingrich kind of turned politics into a blood sport, so the nastiness level went up. The 2000 election, which was basically decided by the Supreme Court, was another turning point. The election of Donald Trump was a turning point, and 2024 could be a turning point. So when I look at the 40-year time period, there are several critical elections that when people wonder, like, how did we get from where we were several decades ago to where we are now? Like, there were 4 or 5 major elections that kind of accelerated polarization and extremism.
We have 2 questions. I'm going to go with the gentleman in the beige, yeah, and then we'll go with the gentleman in the green.
Hi, so thank you so much for your time and for being here. My question is mostly about that you mentioned that you're a long-term optimist. Do you see those same effects in terms of like political polarization, or do you think that over time we'll still be equally polarized, but that the Democrats will just be in control and be able to restrict like these radical policies?
Actually, I am optimistic that we will get a better handle on polarization. in part because of the demographic changes and the generational changes that I talked about, but also just from a historical standpoint. Like, this is not the first time America has been highly polarized. If you look at the 1790s, the 1890s, and then the 1990s and beyond, they were all periods of intense partisanship and polarization. But polarization cannot last indefinitely because it's really dysfunctional for a political system, because it's hard to address problems, it's hard to take actions. Like, things happen around the world where there needs to be action. And so there is some limiting effects. And so I do think this has been a very long period of polarization. Like, if you think it kind of goes back to the 1990s, like, we're talking about almost 30 years. From a historic standpoint, most periods of polarization last, let's say, 10 or 20 years, but not 30 years. So we should be at a point where something is going to happen to change the dynamic. Sometimes it's an external event, like a war will unify people. And if conflict between the US and China accelerates, and let's say in 10 years there's a war, wars sometimes unify people, not always, but that's a possibility. The Great Depression kind of unified people in the sense of wanting more decisive action than had taken place at that point. So there are lots of ways you can, quote unquote, cure polarization when you look at it from a historical standpoint. So I do think we will get a handle on that. And again, it's a situation where everybody thinks if we're really polarized in 2022, then of course in 2032, it's going to be the same thing. I don't think that's going to be the case. It'll be different.
Yes, sir.
And it actually could be different in a worse way too, so.
Yes, thank you. It seems to me we've got some new technologies around now that we've never had in our history, which promote the ability of people to dispute facts. And the whole notion of what is truth, what is fact, is now a topic that 30 years ago we weren't having those kinds of arguments. And it seems to me it's only getting worse. And I'm wondering why you think that 10 years from now that trend isn't going to continue and make things even worse.
Because there are policy solutions that can actually address that issue. So one of the first things I did when I went to Brookings is we set up a Center for Technology Innovation. So we've done a lot of work on a wide range of tech problems, including misinformation and disinformation. Part of the problem in that area is the lack of legal liability on the part of the social media platforms. Like, in 1996, when Congress passed the Communications Act, the internet had just started. The Clinton administration debated whether they should regulate the internet, and they made a decision not to regulate the internet because it was relatively new, no one knew how it would unfold. That decision has basically persisted through the current period. We basically have had a libertarian stance on the internet and digital technology in general. That area is subject to much less regulation than education, healthcare, transportation, finance, or any other part of American society. Right now, there is a backlash against some of these tech problems. There actually is a growing bipartisan spirit in Congress. David Cicilline, as a progressive Democrat, has joined forces with several conservative Republicans on bipartisan legislation. They have bipartisan sponsors where they want to address some of these issues in terms of market competition, the need for privacy, but also legal liability on the part of social media platforms. So don't project what the situation is now, 5 or 10 years into the future. At the state and local level, we're already seeing states and municipalities adopt much tougher regulations on the tech sector. The European Union is doing the same thing, and what they're doing affects what we do. So I do think we will get a handle on that. There's going to be more regulation in that sector.
We have time for one more question. I can, while someone's thinking of a question, because I want to give you time to, if you're going to purchase the book and get it signed and talk to Darrell personally. One thing about the technology is that you can argue that the innovation of radio and then who took over radio in terms of propaganda, both obviously we know with Hitler's regime, but also in the United States, there were people who were very popular on the radio, but they were just saying what they wanted people to know. And it was very hard to find out anything else. The major newspapers were owned by people. And we had this sort of weird time, and this is Darrell's expertise, where media became more objective, but it was a very short period of time in American history. Right, 1930-ish to about 1990, and that was it. But other than that, it has not been objective. It has been slanted and owned by wealthy people with an agenda. And you can argue the same thing for, network news. We all got the truth, but the truth was determined by the network news, and there wasn't an alternative voice, PBS NewsHour, which today I think a lot of people say watch PBS NewsHour. So I think thinking about how technology upends, but also who manipulates technological innovation to communicate. Joe McCarthy was excellent on the radio and outstanding on TV, and anti-democratic. So I'm not sure if we go back in time that there's this point that's, this place where there was no misinformation or manipulation. So something to think about. We have a lot more of it today, and I think to end on this note, after we, thank Darrell, we also have greater political and social participation by more people, and very much different kinds of people in 2022 in America than we've ever had before. And with that participation comes a lot of noise. So we have to think to ourselves, if you think about the noise and it's giving you a headache, realize that part of it is generated by just a vastly increased scope of participation by a lot of people that could not participate 30 years ago, 50 years ago, or were not here to participate. So I think that's something to keep in mind. I want to recommend the book, and lastly to say that what Darrell West does, probably better than anybody else, is he writes an incredibly well, super engaging book, and uses political science, public opinion, public commentary in a very rigorous, smart, and engaging way. So when you read his work, everything's justified, everything's backed up, and then you get exposed to a lot of voices also in the sphere that you might not otherwise, in a very efficient vehicle, this book. So I highly recommend it. And on that note, I want to thank you very much, Darrell, for coming and welcome you. So Darrell will be outside. There's some books and there's a reception, and we'll be around for a little while. So please feel free to stay.